And welcome to lecture video, well, technically lecture video 3, chapter two's lecture. And so chapter 2 is all about the political and legal environments of the criminal justice system. So if you remember from last time in one of the two videos, and I believe actually in both, I mentioned that I'm excited about the law aspect, the lawyer, the courts, all that. That was my area of interest when I was in criminal justice. So I'm passionate about this. So we'll talk a little bit about this. Yeah, we'll just kind of go through it. As always, the chapter and the textbook. If you don't remember how to get there, under Start Here for course content, our course syllabus will always tell you the week and what's due on that week. And your textbook is right here. And when you click on it, it pulls up this larger page. Make sure you scroll down. And since this is week 2, chapter 2 we're talking about, this gives a brief overview. And then each section is part of the chapter. So you will read section 2.1, 2.2, 2.3, 2.4, and 2.5 since they're all part of this. Anyway, with that in mind, we will just dive into it. So, again, my notes are going to be a little bit different and not necessarily, the most beautiful, elegant. So, this is meant to be supplementary to the reading, so you can do this entire class just from reading, but I'll go over some main things. We'll bring up discussions, things like that. So, yeah. So the text says it, and this is definitely true if you know anything about history. If you're interested in history, please, take a history class. This is something that's really cool. But realistically speaking, historically, we've always had rules or laws to protect societal norms. Like, that is something that has been part of human culture for almost ever. And if you talk to, history professors and historians, one of the earliest ones they point to is the Code of Hammurabi, which was a list of rules for the kingdom that they had to follow. There's a lot of different ancient structures of rules. So we've always had laws, and law, we're using a very broad term here. But it's always just been rules that protect societal norms. And so the biggest difference is that it used to be everyday citizens. We still technically have citizens arrest and things like that in our modern society. But truly, there was a change to the uniformed individuals. That's, in the grand scheme of human history, that's modern. That is something that's within the last few hundred years. Realistically, going way further back, you're looking at everyday people would go up to whoever was in charge of the town or any of that. So serfs would go to the lords or the landowners and things like that, and they'd say, this person stole from me, and then or the punishment would go with the crime. And we'll talk about that here in a little bit. So we've always had this kind of system, but in our more modern times, we now have the uniformed individuals. We have the police officers. We have agents. We have all those things that we come to think of as a modern society. When we hear the words criminal justice system, we think, oh, police officers, cops. We think sometimes maybe FBI agents. We think state troopers. We think lawyers and judges. And yeah, to a point, some of those have been around for a long time, but some of them haven't. So it's just important to understand that criminal justice and the criminal justice system is not a new concept. Really, the uniformed individuals and the structure of how it works, that's really the stuff where things have changed over time. And so, since this is a criminal justice America kind of course, we're going to talk about our system, ideally. So, our criminal justice system is that of dual. Ooh, I'm off to a great start tonight with my notes. Sorry about that. but we have a dual federalism system. And this is one of those key words that I'll tell you right now won't be on a quiz, but would definitely show up on a midterm or final exam. Hint, hint, nudge, nudge, make sure you pay attention. So our system is that of a dual federalism system. And that means that there are two unique and diverse groups or governments or agencies, choose your term you want to use, that make and enforce laws. And here in America, our two systems that are the dual federal system is we have the one federal government. This is the one we're all familiar with. This is Washington, D.C. This is Supreme Court. This is all that stuff. We have the federal government. Whoops, I just made a little boo-boo there. And our other system is our individual state governments. And so, yeah, in general, if you haven't taken FYE class or haven't had me before, you might not be familiar with this, but I do use some shorthand stuff. This is just good note-taking, so notice I have GOVT. Anytime I write that, I am referring to the government, so that's just something to notice for mine, but it will help you with your own thing. Hopefully it saved that. Oh, perfect. Okay, so in our dual federalism system, we have one federal government and we have 50 individual state governments. And we talked about it a little bit in the first chapter, but this distinction means that the federal government looks over federal issues and each state is in charge of their own state issues. So in theory, it states that things are dealt with in-house and the federal just oversees the larger issues. And this is where I'm going to say this week's class, the really good example of modern day issue of the dual federalism system is going to be talking about the Roe v. Wade. So we're both the original Roe v. Wade case and the overturning recently by the Supreme Court. That's going to be our real strong example for this chapter. So I'm just going to even start it right here. Roe v. Wade. And if you're unfamiliar with Roe v. Wade, other than hearing it and since knowing, oh, it's about abortion, we will talk a little bit about it later. Anyway, so as I said, in theory, the states deal with their own things and the federal government has their own overseeing thing. Roe v. Wade's decision was something that the federal government made a decision that superseded the state governments, and now they have since gone against that. So now there's not the federal control, and now it's back in the 50 states. So by removing that federal regulation, it returns to the individual state governments to make their own decisions. And my possible essay question is, what is the issue with this? How will this work? Who should have more say in an individual's rights? Should it be the states or should it be the federal government? Question for thought, not for you to necessarily answer right now, but something to think about because it might show up later. All right, so that's a very brief overview of dual federalism. That is just the idea that there are two unique systems, and we'll talk a little bit about those structures in this kind of lesson today. So regardless of how you look at it, and the textbook talks about this, there is a hierarchy. There's a hierarchy of laws, there's a hierarchy of courts, and we're going to kind of talk about that stuff. So the hierarchy of laws, realistically, we've kind of talked about this last time, if you remember. Constitution is key. It is the main thing. Article 6 of the Constitution, it can be interpreted, and often is interpreted, to mean that federal laws trump state laws when they're in conflict. The issue with that is that the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments of the Constitution, holds the idea that the federal government should be held in balance from having too much power. So literally, we have the Constitution saying federal government can't have too much power, but at the same time saying the federal government can make laws that supersede state laws. It's very problematic, and it comes down to interpretation of the text, and that's another issue that we will talk about here in a little bit. So our text refers to modes of looking at the way our systems operate. We are not really a dual federalism anymore. We're more of a cooperative federalism. And instead of writing federalism again, I'm just going to go cooperative. And so if you've played video games in the last, 20, 30 years, or you're familiar with the concept of cooperation, you already know that cooperative means that you work together. And so that's really more of what America has turned into. While it may have started with the idea of a true dual federalism where you have separate agencies, and sometimes, like right now, we're kind of in that dual system, we tend to lean more towards this cooperative federalism, also referred to in our text as marble cake. And I love it because, well, I'm a big fat guy and I love cake. And marble cake is fantastic because I like marbling. It's a way of patterning and stuff like that. Not important, has no relevance to this, but this idea that instead of being separate things, they're kind of blended together, mushed together, and that really is what we're more like anymore. We're more of this flexible relationship between the federal and state governments on a variety of issues and programs. Typically, if there's an educational program that's working, it tends to get spread across more states and comes to the federal level. And sometimes decisions made at the state level impact federal, and sometimes federal impact the state. And it's not like it's superseding or one over the other. It's more of, hey, this will work. Our modern system, for all the ups and downs, is this kind of amalgamous, weird, amorphous thing. It just kind of flows between stuff. And if you're unfamiliar with some of those words I use, that's okay. Anyway. Yeah. As far as laws are concerned, I kind of got lost on that one because I wanted to talk about our federalism designs, I guess, for our criminal justice system. This is part of the hierarchy of laws, is that truly, technically speaking, the federal laws should supersede the 50 state laws, and that's typically how it works. But in the cooperative federalism model, it still is that way, but the 50 state government laws tend to impact and design the federal government laws. That's a very simplistic overview of it. To read more about it, read the text. Feel free to look up additional stuff. But I want to at least make sure everyone has a basic understanding of what's going on. All right. As far as the courts, we talked about this last time. I know because I made some pretty good notes on it in my own lecture notes. But the court system and the whole criminal justice system as a whole, there is a hierarchy. And if you remember your high school civics, government class, whatever it may be, you'll remember that we have the different branches and things like that. Well, even within the judicial branch, which is this more, court breakdown, I'm making hand gestures that you can't see. I don't know why, but I'm always going to do it, so apologies there. But within that court system, there is still a hierarchy. And it should go without, stating that Congress and Supreme Court are, top tier of that. So like laws, there is a distinction between the federal and state courts and their laws. Congress holds decision and power over federal courts as well as finances. So Congress tends to be the big one. They're the ones that determine, what states get individual funding, which funding goes to where, how much is allocated to this. They tend to have a decent amount of power through that. As far as the trial courts, we have the U.S. District Courts, which are the trial courts of the federal system. So not the individual states, but the overall federal government. There's a U.S. District Court. This is the typical trial court. There are limitations. They can oversee nearly all federal cases, both civil and criminal. And there are 94 judicial districts. And that covers, I'm not saying like the 94 is all just in DC. No, that's covering the entire United States and its territories. But with the U.S. District Courts, there's also the U.S. Court of Appeals. Those 94 districts are broken into 12 regional circuits, which have their own Court of Appeals. That's what these are. So really, these are the ones that hear appeals from their district courts, as well as from federal administration agencies. They're sometimes referred to as circuit courts. This is, as we talked about last time in our very brief overview, the appellate court is higher than the trial court. The trial court comes first, their decision. If the defendant is unhappy with their result, they go to a secondary level, which is the appellate court. We'll talk more about the system today, but just wanted to give that brief reminder. And then, as I said, the top level of the court system itself really is the U.S. Supreme Court. This is with the Chief Justice of the United States and 8 associate justices. And each year they have a limited number of cases that they decide on. They tend to be substantial questions about the Constitution or some kind of federal law. And this is where our wonderful example of Roe v. Wade comes in, because that was the Supreme Court decision of this year. That was the big one. This was the thing that was in all the news cycles. There were some other cases that they ruled on, but this was the one that was like, okay, we got to pay attention. And again, we'll keep coming back to it. Today is the Roe v. Wade day. But this is all at the federal level. This is nice, and we can talk more about it, but we should talk about the state level because, well, number one, the states follow a similar model, but at the same time, we live in a unique location, living in PA, and we'll talk about that. So the state court structure itself, each state has their own hierarchy of courts. And it's important to note that oftentimes, not always, but there can be such a thing. I don't want to write it right next to Roe v. Wade. I want to come down a little bit. Okay. So in the state court structure, gosh, this is terrible. I am sorry. It's not a pyramid scheme, but it does work in a pyramid structure. Your very top of the pyramid tends to be sometimes called, and this is, kind of dark, but the court of last resort. I really love the name because it's dark. And I kind of like dark things, like dark subjects. Oh, it fixed my triangle. Nice. Court of last resort. This is often a state Supreme Court. And that's an important thing to note. So we have a government Supreme Court that resides over the federal government, but some states also have a Supreme Court. So it's not just... So when someone says the Supreme Court, they tend to be talking about the federal Supreme Court, the big one. But that's not to say that it's not the state. PA does have a state Supreme Court. Just fun fact for you, and it has 7 total justices. Then at this second tier down, and I will add lines in here in a minute. These are the intermediate. I'm just going to put inter because it's going to take forever if I write out all these things. These are the appellate courts that I mentioned last time. Gosh, I am struggling today. I am sorry. But so that top level is the Supreme Court of a state. If the state does not have one, their highest level would be their intermediate appellate courts. Their specifically Intermediate Court of Appeals. It's just the appellate court is the easy way to say that. So it's important to note that that does exist. Then there tends to be circuit or district courses. Sorry, I'm thinking about Mario Kart apparently. Our circuit courts are this next tier down. These are the larger area groups. These are the kind of like trial places. Wow, this is derailing quickly. Let me take a breath. Reverse. Okay. The circuit courts, this level here, this third level down, this is, if we remember back to the idea from the federal, that there are districts, there's 12 regional circuits. It's the same concept at the state level. So like Erie County. Erie County would have a circuit court. That's the typical breakdown of how that would work. And then this last level, the book doesn't use the term. This is an older term. I've heard it used before, but I didn't see it in the text, so I'm not sure if it's a relevant term anymore. But it's sometimes referred to as the lower courts. And the lower courts are really just, they're probate courts, so probation. They're juvenile courts. They're family court. It's not for, these are the criminal courts up here. So like serious crimes, murder, arson, grand theft auto, like these are under the circuit courts. The lower courts are things like divorces, endowments, probation hearings, things like that. This is the typical breakdown that most states follow. Like I said, if they don't have a state Supreme Court, their top level is their appellate court. But it's important to note that here in PA, we have another court, and it's actually part of this section. It's part of this middle one. We have an extra little court that's the Commonwealth. Ooh, there we go. So our Commonwealth Court in particular, it's unique to PA, and it's matters involving the state and local governments with regulation committees. And so actually, I'm going to pull up a separate page real quickly, only because it's actually super relevant, and I will include this link on Blackboard in those additional resources. What is it? Under course-specific content. So this is from the official, U.S. government, pacourts.us. This is the Unified Judicial System of Pennsylvania, and it's an interactive thing that actually has our breakdown of how Pennsylvania has its court system. It's the top down. Like I said, this is how most states follow this model, but ours is unique in that we have our Superior Court, which is our Intermediate Court, and our Commonwealth Court. So you see, when you click on this, it gives information. So here, there's 7 justices in our state Supreme Court. gives a little history on it. Most often, this is what, not exclusively the court reviews. This is a great way to learn what each of these systems do. That's why I'm going to provide it specifically to PA. Just because if you are taking these courses here and you plan on going into the criminal justice system, chances are that you plan on going into the criminal justice system here in Pennsylvania. So it's important to know our system. Anyway, as I said, we have the Superior Court, which is our appellate court. This is the Intermediate Appellate Court. Look right there. Boom. They're the ones that are the final decision. The Supreme Court for the state may let a case be overruled from this point, but this tends to be the top tier for most cases. And then the Commonwealth Court, like I said, this is specifically for matters involving state and local governments. This is things like EPA has some kind of issue with the way something is being done within a certain government agency, or not government agency, local government agency thing. That's when this stuff comes in. Our Court of Common Pleas, as we call it, this is that circuit/district court, 60 judicial districts. Like I said, this is like Erie County stuff. These are appeals from the minor court. These are matters involving children and families, things like that. The minor courts, this isn't the serious crimes. This is where serious crimes can go to the next level. But this is usually for preliminary arraignments and hearings, setting bail, except in murder or manslaughter cases. But these are the low-level stuff. So that is how our system works, how the PA judicial system is broken down, the court system. So if you want to know more, like I said, I'll include this link on Blackboard under the course-specific content. If not, you can choose to ignore it. All right. That's it for my little sub-piece on this. So, as far as our own system works, I just want to make sure that I'm pulling up the right information. It should be here. Nope. I went one too far. Okay. So the other thing that we need to talk about is the hierarchy of lawmaking. And this comes down to the Supremacy Clause, which is Article 2 or Clause 2 of Article 6. This is where people point to, hey, this is how, here we go. I knew I would find it on this page somewhere. Okay, so the second clause of Article 6 of the Constitution pronounces, this is the terminology that is used in the actual Constitution. This Constitution and the laws of the United States, which shall be made in pursuance thereof, and all treaties made of which shall be made under the authority of the United States, shall be the supreme law of the land. And the judges in every state shall be bound thereby. Anything in the Constitution or laws of any state to the contrary, notwithstanding. As I mentioned before, we're going to have an issue of what exactly does this mean, because we get into the issue of interpretation. And so, yes, much like we had, officers have discretion, we have an issue in the court system, which is interpretation. So if you have ever heard someone make the argument that it is my Second Amendment right to own a gun, it is my First Amendment right to say whatever the heck I want, it is and it isn't, and it comes down to the interpretation of the text. And again, we're going to talk about that here in a little bit, but to give you a little taste of what the issue is here is, do you read the Constitution as it's written with the, pre-technology era? or do you interpret it to a modern context? If you interpret it to a modern context, some things are going to have to change. If you read it to only the verbatim words and how it was written, it changes a lot of issues. So the interpretation of the Constitution is what has led to a lot of debates over what is a right and what isn't. So this piece, though, that we looked at right here, this is the supremacy clause. This is the, shall be the supreme law of the land. So anything that the Constitution or the laws of the United States make shall be supreme law of the land. Every state shall be bound to these supreme laws of the land. That's the supremacy clause. That's what they're going for. The issue is, does that mean it always wins? So, as I said, that's the dual executive branch issue. As with courts, there are, well, I guess I kind of jumped the gun there. This is the issue with just our dual federalism system, with our two system. How do you interpret something? So I kind of jumped the gun. Dual executive issue. As with our courts, we have dual in law enforcement. And this is something that people tend to not realize or forget or misinterpret. So federal agents, if you hear a train going by, I'm sorry, I live by the train tracks. Anyway, federal agents can only enforce federal laws, and local law enforcement can only enforce local laws. This is where people go, but wait, can't a police officer stop me for breaking a federal law? Yes. They can assist a federal agency in apprehending someone. So if you break a federal law, yes, they can stop you, but they hand your case over to a federal agent. And vice versa. If a federal agent catches you breaking a state law, they will hand it over to the state law enforcement. So technically, they cannot themselves charge you with that crime, but they can hand your case over, and then you will be charged by the proper body. So it's a misunderstanding and very weird way of wording that some people tend to struggle with, but it's important to note the executive branch dual system issue is that technically they cannot supersede someone's authority. So like how often we see in television shows that, the feds come in and they take over the investigation and everything's sidewalled. It's not really how it goes. Yes, they come in, but if it's a federal case, you tend to work with them and that kind of thing. So anyway, going back to this marble cake idea real quick, the cooperative, we talked about the federal government and the 50 state governments, but I failed to mention something because it comes up later in the chapter, and I was hoping, even though I can't hear you, I'm hoping someone out there went, but Mr. Wheaton, there's more to it than just that. And you're right. There is a third layer to this, and this is the one that is kind of weird. So I'm just going to write it. And you read that correctly. Local governments. So within those 50 state governments, there are local government jurisdictions. We have, in Erie alone, we have our Erie Police, but there's also Lawrence Park Police. There's Harbor Creek. There's Northeast. There's Fairview. There's Girard. Go through every county in Erie, and they all have their local governments. They have their local elections, authorities, things like that. That's part of this system. Yes, they're all part of the larger state government, but they too are unique. So the best way to describe this is these are the ground troops, these are the teachers, these are the people that are in the trenches, these are the ones that you see on the front lines. These are who you typically see when you see and think about law enforcement, when you think about criminal justice system. You tend to think about, at least if you're someone like me, you tend to think about the local level first. So these are part of this. And this is why there's, and we'll talk about it here in just a second, but local governments can pass ordinances. Ordinances are really minor laws. They aren't recognized by the whole state, and so they can only be fined. They can't be, actual jail time. So this is why, in the city of Erie, there is no open container law. So you can technically walk around downtown with a container of alcohol that's not covered with a brown paper bag to hide the fact that it's an alcoholic beverage. But you go somewhere else and, you're not allowed to do that. Like, that is a local ordinance. That is a specific thing. So that's a good, real example here in our own area of how a local government has an ordinance that's different than a state law, because, there is no open container policy in PA as a state. It's more of at the local level. It's a really weird one, and I'm sorry if that was potentially troublesome for anyone, but it's the first thing I can always think of when thinking about a real-world example. Okay. Excuse me, I had to get a little drink. So, to slightly switch gears just a little bit, we're going to talk about something that's problematic in general, but especially problematic when we talk about it in the sense of criminal justice. And if you can figure out what I'm writing before I finish it, awesome for you. If not, it's politics. And so I'm going to ask you this question right now, and then we're going to talk about it, and I'm going to come back to that question. Is the criminal justice system inherently political? And I mean, when I say inherently, I want to make sure you're getting the word I'm saying. Inherently, it is inborn. It is part of it. It is something that you cannot avoid. It is within its DNA. Is criminal justice, the system itself, inherently political? And so, let's back away from that question and talk about what the chapter talks about and some other things that are interesting and things to know. So, in a democratic republic, there are two ways in which a criminal justice decision maker is picked, and that is either being elected by the public or appointed by a public official who was themselves elected by the public. So technically it's always chosen from the public, but sometimes it tends to be placed by someone who was elected. And just real quick, a democratic republic is what America is. People see this word and tend to get confused because you were raised, for the most part, being told America is a democracy. We are, but we are a democratic republic. Just an important term to remember in the back of your head. So in the U.S., there are two ways that which we decide who our criminal justice decision makers are, whether that be sheriffs or judges or things like that, and that's that they're either elected by the people or they are appointed by a public official that we, the people, voted in. And so when it comes to lawmaking, most states rely on old common law for historical foundations. So, like, we tend to go to our oldest roots and say, if it's not broke, don't fix it. But criminal law is a little different. Our criminal laws are mostly a matter of statute. I've said this word before, but it's important to just, make sure you understand the definition. A statute, not a statue, S-T-A-T-U-T-E, not S-T-A-T-U-E, which would be a statue. A statute, like the statute of limitation, which most people tend to know. It deals with how long you're allowed to go after a crime that's been committed against you. Anyway, statute is just a written law passed by a legislative body. It's just a fancy word to say a law that was written and passed. It's not just someone said it, it's actually written down somewhere. And so for criminal law, they're mostly matters of something that we've written down recent or fairly recent. So these are decisions that are made by assemblies and then enacted. And the assembly could be the state Supreme Court, the federal Supreme Court, it can be a higher court, whoever makes the governing decision for the law of that area, that is how we follow it. And so this is something that we're starting to see in the criminal justice system, and it's important to note we are seeing a trend forming from the classic get tough incarceration model to a rehabilitation model. We'll talk a little bit about more of that later, but I just want to bring it up here because I don't want to forget it. So, in lawmaking, it kind of is political, but it isn't political because we do make laws, we make statutes that say that this is what we're doing, and it's made by people that tend to be appointed or elected. And in policing, to be effective, law enforcement must be seen as fair and impartial. And I want to read that again. For police officers and law enforcement to be effective, they must be seen as fair and impartial. So they have to try to stay as far away from politics as possible. The issue here is that the political climate of a community can impact a department and how it operates, for good or for bad. And so I want to preface this next part with a little bit of a warning. I am going to talk about the facts around Minneapolis, Minnesota, and George Floyd. We're not getting into a debate on what was legally right or wrong, but this is historical fact that we need to talk about as to how this happened. So, very specifically, the city itself, Minneapolis, Minnesota, actually has a long history of racism. This goes back to almost its founding. You can do this research yourself as well. It is out there. It is a majorly white city. I believe, it used to be 74% white. It's still well over 50% white. So it is majorly white. Several grassroots rights groups for like Native Americans, Black Americans, Latin Americans, like a lot of groups tried starting, hey, these people deserve rights groups there. Not all of them went places. This is a very hard place to live. There's extreme unfair pay, education, housing, and health care historically in Minneapolis. It was a place where the KKK rose up at some points. It's a place where in a post-World War II era, they used the Jewish people as a scapegoat. Like, legitimately, this is a place that has been engaged in history in racism for a long part of their history. Knowing that, and thinking about the policing state in Minneapolis during the George Floyd incident, it doesn't excuse it, but it explains how that came to be, how the department themselves started with nothing wrong happened, and then public testimony and video evidence shows that the police were covering it up. It's not the first time police there have done this. There was, I don't remember which study, but there were over 200 cases of violence against Black individuals from police officers in Minneapolis, Minnesota over the last, I think, 20 to 30 years. So understanding that politically speaking, it is a place that is hostile towards people that are not white and Protestant tends to show you that that kind of thing can happen. So again, the political climate of a community can impact a department for good or for bad. Because remember, at the end of the day, the people that are in these positions are people like you and me. We all have opinions. We all have beliefs. The problem is we have to be able to separate our beliefs when we're in a position of power like this. And so remember, as I said before, in policing, to be effective, law enforcement must be seen as fair and impartial. Okay. Deep discussion about that over. Moving on. Not much brighter, but in the prosecution aspect of politics in criminal justice system, it is very political, considering everyone at that level is elected into position. So, yeah, they owe it to the people who elected them. In the judiciary level, all judges, I don't know if you knew this, but if you didn't, you learned something else new today. All judges are either elected or appointed. So that is also inherently political. You vote on a judge, or they're appointed by someone in the government for it. That is completely political. And because they often deal with public opinion, this runs into the problem of, they're too strict, they're too lenient, they're too liberal, they're too conservative. This thing happens a lot because judges end up making these decisions on, which case has more facts and is the winner of a court case. And sometimes, and this is a hard thing to say because I like to believe the best in everyone, sometimes the bad guy wins a court case. I'm sorry to tear the Band-Aid off for you, but sometimes the bad guy wins the court case. And you can't blame a judge, because if the case itself had evidence to prove, that's it. And so this is where I go for another modern issue that's been recent. I don't want to spend too much time because it's less of a criminal crime or anything, but the Johnny Depp and Amber Heard case. Reminder that court case that was televised, that everyone was talking about for weeks and months, it was a case of, did Amber Heard's op-ed piece defame Johnny Depp in any way, shape, or form, cause him to lose work? You can point to all the things that Pirates wasn't doing good, he was losing jobs, you can point to all the facts, but at the end of the day, the Depp team put forward more evidence to support that her op-ed piece did more damage to his career than anything did to her career before that moment. And I'm sorry, no matter what side you're on, doesn't matter what side you're on, but according to the justice system, that it is fair and done in an equal manner, the evidence was there for Depp's side, not Heard's side. Again, we're not going to dive into a debate. I don't need you thinking that, I'm a woman hater or anything. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying from the purely evidence-based, in the criminal justice system, in the court system, he had the case won. He had the evidence. So it's important to note, public opinion, people tend to have thoughts on what a judge is doing. They are meant to either be the truth seeker or the jury is the truth seeker, and the judge simply makes sure that everything is held up. Jury found in favor of one group. You can debate it. That's what the appellate courts are, but this is what we're talking about. All right. In corrections, political power determines funding, and political elections determine leadership. So while not necessarily directly political, it's not like, a corrections officer is elected. They tend to, apply for a job and work their way up through the system. But the people who determine funding and the people who determine leadership tend to be the ones that are elected. And they have a direct impact on corrections. So the question becomes, as I said, Is the criminal justice system inherently political? And I would argue at this point in time, based off of what I just said and everything I covered and everything the textbook covered, I would say yes. Politics is inherently tied to the criminal justice system. It shouldn't, but it is, because a lot of the positions of power that make these decisions are made in a political manner. And something the text says that I really want to emphasize here before we move on to the next piece is that emotionally charged decisions do not tend to be rational. Since politics is so closely involved, it's important that we try to maintain this distance when possible. We make emotionally charged decisions. Politicians live off this. I wish I was kidding, but a good, again, like them or hate them, if we look at the data, the large fear of a lot of Americans when Obama became president was a black man as president was nerve-wracking. And so the next election, when it was between a white woman and a white man, more often than not, the people that felt afraid went for the white male. We see this extremely clearly and this dates me a little bit, but if some of you in this class are old enough, you'll know what I'm talking about. After September 11th, 2001, when we had the attack on the Twin Towers in New York City and the Pentagon, this shook the nation up. This was the first attack on U.S. soil from a foreign invader since the War of 1812. So it was a big deal. And this lack of safety led to the rise of the ever classic Big Brother is watching you kind of idea that we live in today, where the government's always watching. It's this, we were okay with the government monitoring every call, text, email, etc., because it was under the guise of protecting us from terrorism. It was to make sure that any potential terrorists here in our country, we would know about them right away. We're going to access all your things, but we're not going to keep any of it. We're just going to purposely only look for terrorists. If you know anything about the history of all that kind of stuff and, listening in and keeping records, tends to not be purely that. But that kind of lack of protection for our information, that came from a fear that politicians used to say, I've always wanted to bug the American citizen to find out anyone who could be a foreign agent. So, you know what? Let's do this. And if they say anything wrong about this president, we can arrest them too. All of a sudden, you open up a whole different can of worms. And so, that's why it's important to remember, while it's political, we have to be aware of that. We need to, if you are going into this system and if you are in these classes and you plan on getting a degree or a certificate in some kind of criminal justice program, you plan on going into this system, know that this is an inherently political system. Don't let that control you. All right. Quick little second. Big sip of water and back. Okay. So Herbert Packer is mentioned here in our textbook. 1964, he came up with these two models for a criminal justice system in America, and it's still fairly accurate. Crime control versus due process. You've heard due process. We talked about it last time, but that's the idea that everyone has the freedom to choose and the right to a fair and expedient trial. The idea that, everyone is treated equally. It maintains this fairness to all citizens, and it limits the police power to prevent oppression from happening. So we're familiar with due process, but crime control is this idea that we repress crime no matter the cost. This is the enhance the power of the police. This is focus on discovering truth and establishing facts. I don't care about their personal life. I don't care about what led them to this. I don't care if they are a citizen of the United States. If they broke a law, well, guess what? We need to make sure that we stop the crime no matter what. That's the distinct difference. And now, I know because there's probably going to be at least one person out there that does this, where if they haven't read the chapter yet, they're going to go, this sounds like the difference between Democrats and Republicans. It's not. That's the scary thing. So this is a constant back and forth in the criminal justice system. It's not just Democrats and Republicans. I'll tell you right now, there are a lot of conservative Republicans that believe in the due process system. They believe that we need to limit police power to prevent oppression. But we also have conservative Republicans who believe that we need to enhance the power of the police to stop crime. And the same with, we have very liberal Democrats who believe police power will stop crime. And we also have liberal Democrats who believe that, limiting police power is going to protect more people. It's not a black and white issue. And that's something that needs to be emphasized going forward. The criminal justice system tries to work in black and white, and the world is not in black and white. There's a lot of gray, which is why there's a constant back and forth within our system between two sides of things, because we want it to be a binary. There's only two options, nothing else. But if you are here now, you know that I'm not telling lies. Our world is more than just two sides. It is a whole lot more. And so, to move a little bit away from this two system, our textbook talks briefly about the juvenile justice system. And as I said before, if you want to know more about the juvenile justice system, we have a juvenile justice class that's exclusively focused on that system. We will also possibly talk about this during one of our special topics weeks. So I'm only going to very briefly go over this because, like I said, if you want to know more about this, take the class. But the juvenile system in America was established as a way to rehabilitate individuals because we had previously been treating them as adults, and our system back then and still to this point is punishment. So it was based on this British policy that the government acts as a parent, because sometimes parents aren't quite good at their job, and that's parens patriae. It's just really the idea that adolescents need parental guidance. They don't need punishment. They need to be treated fairly. They need to be guided with a loving hand. Maybe firm, but it's a loving hand. And so as it started, it was kind of like the Wild West. Nobody really had set rules. Everyone kind of had their own system. Each state did something different. So some were softer, up in the air. Some were a little too rigid, things like that. But they tended, as our system of government started focusing in and figuring out stuff, everything gets reformed. And so around the 1980s, there was a change. This was due to the crack epidemic. All of a sudden, all criminal justice, law enforcement stuff ended up going more to this tough on crime model, where you don't need tough love, you need to be punished, and that's how you're going to get better. That led to harsher sentences and changes and reforms in the system of juvenile justice. So it went less from almost like, boys will be boys, kids will be kids, we'll let them off the hook too. You got to do the time. You're going to be 8 months in a facility. It changed how that system looked. And we're still seeing a bit of that. Like I said earlier, not just in the juvenile justice system, but the overall criminal justice system. We are seeing a change towards rehabilitation again. But we'll see how that's going. We don't necessarily have all that data right now, but it's something to note that there's a shift in how we look at this. All right. That's all I want to say about the juvenile justice system. As far as we should talk a little bit about my friend and yours, the federal Supreme Court. And if you aren't familiar with this information, this is important to know. There are 8. Hold on. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There are 8 associate justices and 1 chief justice for the Supreme Court. Our chief justice is John G. Roberts Jr. He and 2 of the other associate justices, Clarence Thomas and Samuel Alito Jr., all 3 of those were put into the Supreme Court during Bush Jr., which would be George W. Bush, the president during 9/11. For those of you who are old, well, if you're old enough, you are familiar with the 2 different Bushes. Then we also have Sonia Sotomayor and Elena Kagan were both put into the Supreme Court by President Obama. And then during President Trump's time, he put in Neil Gorsuch, Brett Kavanaugh, and Amy Coney Barrett. And then most recently, President Biden put in Ketanji Brown Jackson, where there was support on both sides and the whole thing. Most of these decisions tend to not be super politically charged. Like, people don't usually get up in arms. There was a couple with during President Trump's time, but that's for a different conversation for a different time. What's important to note is that these justices get put into place by a president. They put forward a nomination for who they want, and then they get sworn in and all that other fun stuff. But very important, it comes from retirements and from deaths. So the big name that people tend to know because she was a fairly prominent name in the Supreme Court is Ruth Bader Ginsburg. She's one who passed away, and one of her seat was one that had to be filled. So that's just a name that if you've heard anything about the Supreme Court before, you probably heard Ruth Bader Ginsburg's name. Just important to give a shout out to a very powerful, small political woman. Anyway, so as far as the Supreme Court is concerned, when they make policies, remember they have the power of judicial review. They get to interpret the laws and the Constitution. So they look at the Constitution and go, does this law match what the Constitution says? And if it does, it's fine. But if it doesn't, that's when they decide to void or say, it's unconstitutional, it's not going to work, that kind of thing. And so the decisions, they review the decisions of Congress and determine its constitutionality. And this is where our example for today keeps coming back in. The Roe v. Wade case. This was the most recent big decision from our Supreme Court looking at, is abortion a constitutional right protected? The big thing of Roe v. Wade was the ruling determined that abortion was a constitutional right. They looked at the due process clause of Amendment 14 that protected against state action the right to privacy. And the 9th, which was certain rights outlined in the Constitution shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. And so that ruling at that time was determined that abortion is a woman's right. It is a privacy right, and they're allowed to seek it without retribution from the state. And so by the Supreme Court overturning that decision, that means that each state now can enact any law with a asterisk on any for or against abortion. So now it's up to the individual states to determine, how do you deal with abortion? Is it legal in your state? Is it not legal? If it's illegal, what is the equivalent punishment for committing that crime? And that's what has so many people frustrated, is because this is a stepping stone backwards for equality. This is one of those decisions that leads to potential recalling, as Clarence Thomas, one of our associate justices, had mentioned, and this had made its rounds, that, taking back the gay marriage rights kind of decision. If you can overturn something that the Supreme Court previously had said was a constitutional right, where does it stop? So there are some issues with this, and that's kind of what I want to dive in here, is that I said it before, these are all just people. We have our opinions. Supreme Court justices make decisions from their worldview. So I wanted to identify that on our current Supreme Court, 3 justices, including our Chief Justice, was put in by a Republican president, and another 3 were put in by our most recent Republican president. So 6 of our grand total of 9 are from a Republican decision, which usually means that they have similar worldviews as the political leader. Not always, but it's important to note that this does play a part. That means there's only 3 that were appointed by Democratic. And so this tends to be the way the court sways. Supreme Court, 6-3, that's a majority vote, 2/3 vote. This is why it's important to know, who your Supreme Court justices are, who's in power, what decisions are being made, what policies do they support. There's a lot to go in if you're interested in this side of the politics. If you're interested in this side of the law, this is a reason to get into law. Make the change. If you don't agree with how this works, change it. So yeah, just remember, they're people. They make decisions from their worldview. So, to go back to our previous question that I kind of mentioned when we were talking about this, there it is, interpretation. How do we read the Constitution? As it's written or interpreted to be in a modern context? So, this is how we get to an overturning of Roe v. Wade. The original text of the Constitution says nothing about the woman's right to terminate a pregnancy at all. There's nothing there. You can look all you want. But the actual original text says nothing about it. Does that mean that it's not a constitutional right? Well, if you are looking at it with a modern context, well, no, that is something that's covered. But if you look at it from how it's written, no, it's not covered. The right to bear arms, the one that people tend to point to for the right to own guns, if you look at just the body of the text, it's you can own guns to protect yourself from foreign invaders, or if the government chooses to turn its attention on you and you need to form a militia. That's what the Second Amendment is literally saying. How we interpret it is that every American citizen has the right to own a gun to protect themselves. Yeah, you're not wrong. We are able to protect ourselves. But from foreign invaders, it's not happening. Are you hoarding and owning guns because you're preparing for when the government decides to come and attack you? I'm sorry, that tends to be something that a doom prepper or conspiracy theorist person believes, because 9 times out of 10, government doesn't care about an individual person unless you're planning on doing something dangerous. So there's a big issue with how you read the Constitution, how you read the laws. And so this is where we get this concept, and the book talks about judicial activism and judicial restraint. Judicial activism is this idea that the court should actively seek to right wrongs that other government agencies promote or will not do anything about. Whereas judicial restraint is this democratic process that should direct changes in policy, where legislature enacts enactments that represent the will of the people. The people vote on it. I vote for proposition whatever. That's the judicial restraint, where the court doesn't make the decision to go, yep, no, they listen to what the people are voting on, and they take that and go, okay. Activism is what we have with the Roe v. Wade. Supreme Court goes, you know what, this isn't okay. This is not a constitutional right. We're going to go back. All right. There was a brief, well, not a brief, there's a decent section on the Civil Rights Revolution and how the judicial system changed throughout that. I'm not going to dive too much into it, but it should be known that, as we talked about, as our world changed, as things changed around us, the system went with it. So they mentioned Justice Earl Warren was a big part of the civil rights thing. It's the whole, how the Fourth and Fifth Amendment came to protect the individual citizen from the abuse of power from the federal government. So it's important to note that the political pendulum of the Supreme Court, the chief justices, and the number of similar leaning justices will tell you what way the court's going to swing as far as what laws are going to be passed and enacted here in the United States. So, as I said, right now we have 6 tend to be more conservative, so it's going to be a more conservative Supreme Court for a bit. Not to say it won't change, not to say that it can't be, but that you can tend to look at those kinds of trends looking at that. All right. The last thing that we have to talk about today is theories of punishment. And it is the last part of the chapter 2, I should say. And it's important to understand the differences. So, really gonna make a big deal about this. So, the theories of punishment are, I'm making sure I'm spelling it right. Ooh, excuse me. Deterrence, incapacitation, oh, yes, rehabilitation, retribution. Okay, I want to make sure I spelled those right. Sorry. So the theories of punishment are deterrence, incapacitation, rehabilitation, and retribution. So if you're like, what the heck does this mean? Well, you're going to learn right now, or you're going to learn by reading in the text. Deterrence is the idea that the fear of the punishment will reduce or eliminate the undesirable behavior. This is my call out to English 101 students. They perform a cost-benefit analysis. You think about the punishment, you think about the crime, and you make an informed, in air quotes, decision. You look at it and go, I can get 3 months if I steal that, but I'm going to make $8,000? $8,000 for 3 months in prison? You know what? That's not too bad. I'm going to do it. That's the issue with deterrence, is that sometimes the crime is not equal to the punishment for deterrence, and so it doesn't really stop anything. The other thing to note, and I mentioned this last time, recidivism, and I am going to write this one out. RECIDIVISM. Recidivism is the concept that those punished for a crime tend to reoffend the same crime at a higher rate. And this is a statistical thing that shows up, and this tends to poke holes in effectiveness for certain punishment structures. Deterrence is the big one. The recidivism rate for the deterrence concept is really high. So the idea that you're going to scare people away from committing a crime, the recidivism rate shows that people that get arrested for that crime, they're still going to do it. You didn't really incapacitate or rehabilitate them. They're just going to keep doing it. So that's an issue to think about. And I want you to remember the word recidivism. It's very important to criminal justice. It was one of the first terms I learned in criminal justice when I was taking classes. That tells you it's big, especially if you know me. All right. Incapacitation is the simplest concept of the theory of punishment, and that is if a criminal is locked up in a secure environment, they cannot go around victimizing other people. Plain and simple. You're put in prison. Done. The issue with this theory of punishment, this idea of just incapacitation, is it only works until they're released. You held someone in jail for 3 years for, well, let's be honest. You held someone in jail for 40 years for committing murder. They get out. Did you rehabilitate them? No, you just held them so that they couldn't kill anyone else. They get let out after 40 years. Do you think they're going to kill someone again? It's likely. That's the issue with incapacitation. It only works while they're being incapacitated. Rehabilitation, like I said, this is the one that we're seeing more of a push towards again right now. And that has a lot to do with our worldview and our country's worldview on social justice and fairness and life. So rehabilitation tends to be this, we talk about a lot with drugs because, you know, drug rehabilitation means that they're able to go back and get over their drug addiction and come back. Same thing as with crime. We help the offender to become a productive, non-criminal member of society. The concept behind rehabilitation is that you don't punish in a traditional sense. You're trying to cure the individual. You're trying to get them past this notion to commit this crime. The problem with this is that the data that is available already and we've had on rehabilitation programs for offenders shows, again, the recidivism rate is really high. Yeah, rehabilitation. Inmates that go through rehabilitation are having the same recidivism rate as those that aren't. So it's not inherently working, at least not the way it's designed now. And so there's a lot of back and forth, especially since, again, we're moving towards a better understanding of mental health and how that impacts and trauma and things like that. If you're familiar with these concepts, you know that this is something we as a larger society are moving towards. So this is the trend that we're starting to see show up again in the criminal justice system. We'll see if it goes that way, but it's leaning that way. All right. And then the last one is retribution, and this is the easy, obvious one. This is the punishment deserved. This is just desserts. This is proportionality. This is you do this, your punishment is equal to your crime. This is things like the death penalty, life imprisonment. You did the crime, you're stuck with this. This is what you have to do. So the issue with this one, it's very biblical. It's very, eye for an eye. And my favorite, if the world operated on an eye for an eye concept, the whole world would be blind. There are faults with retribution. There's faults with all four of them. So what's the best system? What is the best theory of punishment for an incarcerated individual? If you can't answer that question, you're like everyone else. This is a harder concept than we tend to live in. Remember, Criminal justice, the system itself wants to be black and white. The world is not black and white. Theories of punishment, yeah. Rehabilitation is nice. Incapacitation is nice. Deterrence is nice. Retribution is nice, but it's also problematic. All of them are. And so this system, we've talked about it in these notes. The whole overarching system has a lot going on, but we need to answer another question, or at least ask another question. Is the criminal justice system racist? And I can already hear a couple students, one in particular, you know who you are. Not a bad thing. We go back. But I can hear you already saying, heck yeah, Mr. Wheaton. The issue with the system being considered racist or not is there is a disproportionate minority contact. There is abnormally high contact between people of minority races and those of the criminal justice system. So the data shows a very striking number, and that leads to some issues. And it leads to the question of, is it racist? And to be fair, I'm a white male. I can't talk a whole lot about racism because I don't really experience that on a daily basis, being a white male. It's just the reality. I can't speak for my students of color. I can't. If you want to share your stories, by all means you can. I'm not encouraging it or asking you to, but from my perspective, and I'm trying to be as neutral and understanding as possible, the book talks about it, and this is true. There's a difference between legal and extra legal factors in this disproportionately minority engagement with police. The legal side is, matters of law, like, are they committing crimes? So, is an individual committing a crime? Maybe. And if they are, then, yeah, they're going to have more contact with police. That gets into a larger argument about society and how things are designed to force individuals into those positions. Again, this is not part of this conversation, but it is. So I don't want to dive too far into it. What I do want to focus on is the non-legal, the extra-legal aspects. And these are where, if this is the data that's being shown more often than not, then yes, it is a racist system. These are things that have nothing to do with legality of anything. This is your officer stopping more people of a darker skin complexion that have no issue, nothing that's legal that should be cause, or are the people that are being stopped that are of darker complexion, are they breaking the law? If they're not breaking the law, it proves this racist point. If they are breaking the law, it can be seen that it's not racist. It is actually just doing the job. Again, the world is not black and white. It is very gray. It is a very amorphous place. So, sorry to get a little dark at the end. That's it for the notes for today. Just a general reminder, we did talk about the dual federalism of our government, and it's more of a cooperative, dual amalgamation combined together. The whole thing was talk about political and legal environments in the criminal justice system. Our big example for this week, and something that'll possibly show up on a test, is talking about the Roe v. Wade case, because it is a modern example of something that fits perfectly into what we're talking about. We talked about the structure of the court system, how interpretation of the Constitution and laws impacts us, how politics is inherently connected to the criminal justice system. The Supreme Court makes laws and decisions and tend to be from their own viewpoints. And when it comes to punishment in the criminal justice system, we have currently 4 models, and there's problems with all of them. And your word of the day is recidivism. Put it to memory. All right, thank you very much for listening to me. I know this was long. This is one video instead of two, so I hope I didn't lose you too much, but thanks for hanging in there, and I'll see you soon. Bye for now.